So, as already been outlined in the introduction, this session is all about problem solving and decision making. You've just watched a quick little video, psychology of problem solving, and although it's not directly related, it made some good points that I just want to highlight. The first is it talked about creativity. It highlighted that to solve problems we have to think outside the box and not be constrained by what we believe is true and our assumptions, and we'll look at that as we go through some of our techniques, and these techniques help us to look outside the box, because that 9-dot problem really did exemplify what I'm talking about looking outside the box. The automatic, nobody told people to stay inside the box, people presume they've got to stay inside the box, and as we saw, the lines needed to go far and beyond but to still come back and solve the problem. And when you see the answer, it looks so simple. So let's have a think about problem solving. The process of problem solving and decision making is such a natural process in life. We do it all the time. But for some reason in the workplace, it becomes particularly onerous to some people. And if we don't do it well, we're not going to do our jobs effectively. The problem is that not everyone deals with it effectively, and people do one of three things if they don't deal with it properly. And they are, first, they either become afraid or uncomfortable and just wish that the problem would go away. Sometimes they bury their head in the sand, but we know that this never happens. The problems don't go away. A second reaction sometimes can be feel that they've got to come up with the answer immediately, like some sort of superhero, and come to the rescue. And often those quickly identified ones are not always the best, and we'll look at when we do require that and how we go about it. And thirdly, they look for someone else to blame. So faced with the problem becomes the problem because it's who am I going to blame, rather than trying to actually solve the problem. And even when we don't do one of those things, many people just see the problem as the problem. And by that I mean they're in a negative place before they start even trying to solve what the real problem is. They need to start focusing on the solution, not the problem. And in many situations where we're dealing with problems, we will come across conflict about what is the best solution. We've talked about what conflict management is, and many of us shy away from that. We don't feel comfortable dealing with conflict, and it's the same in problem solving. We don't feel comfortable in dealing with the situation, and that's made worse by our negative thoughts about the fact that it's going to go wrong, that we're going to make a bad decision. And we should be treating it as the opposite. We should be treating it as a chance to improve things. But to do that, you need to have a positive attitude, and you need to have some good methods to follow. Problem-solving processes should be seen as helping the organisation, helping the team or the individuals improve. Similar to what we said about the benefits of having conflict management. You might have a conflict, but after it being managed well, it can build the relationship stronger. And problems, if handled well, managed well, can lead to better, improved, effective performance. Remember, problems and conflicts in the workplace are a fact. They are going to happen. But our chances of improving systems and processes by solving them are great. The information of what is going wrong and what we need to do to fix it is an improvement process and can make us more effective. Taking it from this perspective, we should start to almost welcome having problems. Well, at least the fact that we can openly try and solve them and improve the processes. Because human beings are natural-born problem solvers. That's why we hold the position we do in nature, in the world, and our biggest challenge when we come up with problems that we have to overcome is our fears, and we have to work towards looking for a solution. Notice I said work towards a solution, because we're not going to solve it straight away. It's not a race unless it is an emergency situation, and even then perhaps taking a little bit of time and making it is important then that we take a little bit of time and make a good decision even in emergencies, but we'll examine that a little bit more later. So we need to make sure that we think about it and that we keep calm and we carry on and try and solve the problem. Right then, so let's have a look at our objectives for this session. For this session is to understand problem solving and decision making techniques. By the end of the session, you should be able to explain the importance of clearly understanding the nature, scope, and impact of a problem, explain the relationship between problem solving and decision making, and explain the different techniques used for problem solving and decision making. We've been talking so far about problem solving and decision making together, interchanging them and linking them, and they're sort of entwined with each other. That is true. Effective problem solving includes making decisions, but there are some clear differences, and let's establish those first before we start to look at the techniques for problem solving and decision making. So we've got a table come up on the screen, and we'll just look at some basic differences before we start moving on. So problem solving is about a method, something that's specific and targeted to reach or to decide on what that problem is, not to make the decision. It's about bridging the gap between the way things are, so what's been going wrong, and how they should be, what we want. It's analytical normally. It's about breaking things down and looking at all the pieces and all the details, and it can become quite complex if it's a major problem. It's predominantly focused on the past because we're talking about what has happened and where it's been going wrong, and we're looking at why, how, what, who is responsible. Okay, so that's problem solving. Decision making is a far broader process, and it's a broader action outcome basis. So we're looking for what the outcome is. It's about, well, I suppose it's the art of making choices between the options. So we, in the problem solving, we come up with the options. In the decision making, we make that decision. It's got a psychological element to it because it's not just about the best one. It's about values, emotions, and the environment. So the other side's analytical. But when we're making the decision, we've also got to be thinking about, are people going to be happy with that decision? Is it going to work? Does it fit with what we believe in? And it's focused on the future, not the past, not the problem. And really in decision making, we should have got to say there should be no blame, where we might be looking at in problem solving about who, how, what, who was responsible. In decision making, we're not blaming anybody because we're looking forward, looking to the future. So that really just outlines the differences, which I want to make clear before we start looking at problem solving techniques. So when faced with a problem, what's the first thing we need to do? Remember, these problems can come up at any time. Well, the first thing we need to do is not solve the problem, not to come up with a solution, not like our superhero we talked about in the reactions, because often the motivation for that is just to cover it up as quickly as possible so that no one else notices, and that doesn't work. It tends to just produce us solutions that, as we would say, paper over the cracks, and that's a fatal error, and they come back to haunt us later, with the problem usually getting worse since it's been left. Now, the first thing we need to do is consider what the problem is all about. We need to understand the problem we're faced with it. And to make that easier, we need to decide on what we would call the specification of the problem. And we'll look at that in the next slide. So, deciding on the specification of the problem is a little bit like deciding what we require from something we're going to buy before we go out and buy it, rather than rushing into a purchase, looking at all the details about what we require and researching it before we go out and buy it. Or if we're going to make something, planning it all out, thinking about what it's going to do, how it's going to come to problem, what it's going to be used for before we make it. So there's three areas we can look at when we're looking at the specification of a problem. The first is the nature of the problem. What is it all about? What is it actually about? The scope is how big or how far does it go? So is it a contained problem or does it spread further? And finally, what is the impact? Is it really going to hurt? I mean, does it need to be dealt with now? Has it got a wide-ranging impact across our customers, for example, or is it something internally that we can deal with? We'll take a little bit more detail look at those three areas. So the first we said was nature. What type of problem is it? And this will help us decide, when we've looked at some techniques, about how we're going to approach it and what techniques we might use. And we can usefully divide them into three categories. Problems are usually based on one of these three. So people, processes, or resources. So people, individuals, team members, customers. If it's more general and it's talking about staffing, then it's normally a resource, and we'll talk about that a bit more. Or it can be a problem with the team or the group. So it could be based around poor performance, conflict, personal problems, contracts, bullying, discrimination, general people problems. The second is processes, and we're talking here about structured activities, measuring, monitoring, making, the control of functions, the control of tasks or activities. So where something's gone wrong with one of those, so it might be something to do with a manufacturing process which is failing, dealing with complaints and it's not going well. It can be any activities with steps. It could be rotas, it could be delivery processes. So it's something that's based on a process, a set of tasks. And then finally, resources. And the definition of resources is something ready to use when and if needed. Or it could be talking about economic or a productive factor required to establish an activity. So we're there talking about having something ready to use when we want it, or a factor that could affect an activity. So that can be anything from equipment, supplies, it can be time, money. Those supplies could be energy, they could be office, so might have power cuts, they could be office supplies, they could be production supplies. And as we said, when we talk about people, if it's about not individuals or a team or group and it's about numbers or staff in general, that can be classed as a resource. So it might be skills, experience, they could be the problem. So first thing we do is identify, is the problem related to people, processes, or resources? Next, we need to look at the scope, the coverage, the what and the who, and how many. So who does it affect? What does it affect? Is it about profits, people, equipment, customers, staff? Or does it affect, if it does affect staff, which customers, whose budget, which year? So we need to know about the numbers, basically scope, how far does it go? How deep does it go? And then we can look at who can resolve it. And by that I mean talking about the skills, the responsibility, and the authority to take some actions and do something about it. And finally, in looking at the specification, the details about the problem, we need to look at the impact. What damage can it have? What ramifications will it have? And the first thing of that is it short term, next hour, today? Is it medium term, the next week or month? Or is it a long term problem over the month, year or years? And when it does happen, is it going to cause a financial loss or a customer loss? Which again is financial in some respects, a disengagement of customers or members of staff or an individual? Is it going to cause us legal problems? Is it going to affect our reputation or our standing as a company? So we need to look at all these areas and we need to consider them before we decide how we're going to solve the problem, because we don't want to go off half-cocked or half-baked. We don't want to start charging in there trying to sort something out when we haven't actually looked at what the nature is, who's going to be affected, and what the impact might be. Because that would just be like acting like a hero, as we talked before, and just trying to solve the problem based on emotion of keenness, desperation, embarrassment, whatever it is. But we need to think about it so that we can select the right approach and deal with the problem as is wanted. Now there's a handout about the specification of problems in the resources, and we'll now start to have a look at some problem solving techniques. Look at some recognized problem solving techniques. There are lots of techniques out there. We're going to look at 4. You can research more. Also, the 4 we look at, there's some handouts in the resources and there are links to them. The 4 we're going to look at are PDCA, which stands for plan, do, check, act. We're going to look at the focus model. We'll look at problem definition process, and we'll look at the 8 Ds. So let's take a look quickly at those. So the first one we'll look at is basically a very simple problem solving cycle. The PDCA wheel, sometimes known as the Deming wheel, sometimes known by other terms, is about plan, do, check and act. So we're talking about planning what we're going to do, doing it, checking it, evaluating it, and then acting on it and making sure it's in stone. This has been expanded on and used and developed in many different areas, and sometimes people expand it, and one example is expand it out into 8 steps as they're coming up on the screen, where you select, plan, grasp the current situation, establish the goals, decide on the cause and the actions, implement changes, evaluate them by checking them, and then sort of standardize, put them into practice. So in lots of situations you might be selecting the theme of the problem or the theme of the area for improvement. You then might be planning a schedule for what's going to go on, how you're going to go about the process, and as part of that you want to grasp what the current situation is so that you know what the problem is or what you're trying to improve from, because then you can establish some goals about where you want to go, what you help to achieve, a target. Then you can look at the causes and the actions, the things that are currently making things go wrong. This would be a brainstorming process where you might try and map out any circumstances, any mitigations that have taken place, any things that have caused what's been happening, and from that you come out with some sort of corrective actions that you can implement. You implement them and then you evaluate by looking at the results. So that would be the check process, and then you standardize that approach and try and embed it and continue it and see if it works. And from that you would just go back to the select or plan stage again. So as you can see with the arrows, things roughly link into it, and people have expanded on this and add bits and adapt it to their organizational needs. But the simple basis behind it and behind a lot of problem solving techniques is the PDCA wheel. So that's plan, do, check and act. What we're going to look at is the 8D format, and that stands for the 8 disciplined approach, reportedly developed by the Ford Motor Company, so sort of manufacturing, much more complex in detail but still loosely based on the PDCA wheel. Automotive industry known for continuous improvement. We've got Nissan, Toyota have got their own sort of methods and they're renowned for it, and it's a continuous improvement approach, and it starts with a base where we have to have a plan for solving or defining any prerequisites, so setting out what we want to do and how we want to go about it. As the title indicates, there are 8 disciplines or 8 key steps. They call them disciplines because they talk about embedding them into everything the organisation does. So they start with use of a team, establishing a team that have got the information, the skills and the experience needed to solve the problems. They then talk about defining the problem. We've talked about it already, the nature, the scope and the impact, but they go further with the 5 W's and the 2 H's, so who, what, where, when and why, so the 5 W's, and then the 2 H's are what happened and how did it happen, or how many happened, so that we've got those sort of questions and we can define the problem. You then go on to developing an interim containment plan. We're talking here about manufacturing, so if something's going wrong in the process and we're producing something incorrectly, the first thing we want to do is stop it happening, because we don't want to be building more products with that problem. So we need to put a plan in place to stop it and contain the problem. Contain the problem and stop it continuing to happen, we can start to use everything that we've got when we were doing the defining to start and identify or verify the root cause. So what is actually causing the problem to occur? From that we can choose and verify some corrections. So from that we can decide or select, test some options and things we could do to stop it, and then step 6 we can implement and validate those corrections. By that we're meaning choose the right option, put it in practice and then check that it is having the desired effect. From that 7 we can take preventative measures, so we can modify it, tweak it if it wasn't completely working, and ensure that it is integrated into the process, the team and the organisation. There's no problem solving it in isolation, so it needs to be embedded and everybody needs to take it on board. And then step 8 is congratulate the team on their success or the organisation, and it may seem a minor point, but It's about embedding it, making sure everyone's aware of it, and celebrating the fact that we've solved it, which is another discipline that they say we should get into the fact. So celebrating the fact. It's a longer process for longer term issues, and often for things that have got a high impact. That's why we have to have a containment plan quite quickly. And in some respects, getting to that containment plan is problem solving in its own way, because it's about stopping the problem happening, but it's then about coming on up with a solution. So that's the 8D approach. Next is the focus model. Again, loosely based on the PDCA model, and really an improvement methodology. It guides organisations' improvement efforts and is liked by a lot of large organisations such as the NHS. It is about problem solving, but it's that positive approach about improvement rather than problem solving, and it's just a formalised process to go through. Popular for several reasons. It's very user-friendly and does not require a lot of technical or scientific knowledge or know-how. It's easy to learn, and you can develop it and improve it as time goes on. It helps to keep everyone focused on the improvement effort. It's a structure that processes with processes that encourage focus, accountability, doing your assigned tasks and being part of the machine. It gets people involved in that process. It values the wisdom and experience that people have got and what they can bring, the frontline workers can bring into that sort of process. And it provides a plan and some stepped process, and large organisations, people like stepped processes that they can go through. And it doesn't mean we're just aiming for an overall goal. And it uses data and backs things up to ask questions about the problem, because they say it works. It's renowned for being a good process that works in large organisations. So, what does it stand for? Well, it's focus, and really it's an acronym for FIND, which is a process of identifying the problems or the areas that need improving. The problems will just occur, but this has a focus on saying find the problem or find the improvement. It then goes into organise, so put together a team with the processes, the experience of the process or problems, so they have the authority and responsibility to deal with it. It then goes about clarifying the knowledge, so ensuring that the knowledge of the process is there and ensure that there is agreement on what the real issue is. It then talks about understanding the variations that can happen in the situations you're looking at, so circumstances that could arise that could cause problems. And then finally it talks about selecting a solution to test, so getting your options together, determining which solution is the best and testing them and creating that goal for improvement. So that's focus, find, organise, clarify, understand and select. And really it is a framework for continuous improvement. Finally, we're going to look at the problem definition process. Slightly different, because really what we're looking at here is we always need to define what the problem is, and sometimes that's the hardest point, and this technique is about getting to that. So it doesn't actually solve the problem, and as you can see from the graphic on the screen, at the end it just says state what you've discovered, pose the questions or the hypothesis. So really it's about getting to a stage where we can say what has happened, what should have happened. And the process to get there is to ascertain the situation or the objective. So maybe it's an objective from a senior manager, or it's something that's come up as a problem, but we want to know. It's a bit like a doctor when the patient first comes to the surgery. We know they've come because there's something wrong with them, but we need to ascertain the situation and what the objective is. What are they there for? What have you come to see me for? The second part is to understand the background. So we might have to find out what led to this situation, what led to this problem. And with the patient, it might be about what have they been doing, what have they been up to that's got them to this situation. And then from that, we can isolate the problems from the symptoms and get to the root cause. And a bit like we said about the doctor again, it's not what the symptoms are, we'll be trying to isolate what the problem is and how we've got there. And from that, we can determine some sort of analysis. So from that point, we can outline to, if it was the doctor, we'd be outlining to the patient, well, this is what I think the problem is, and this is how we've got there. From that, we can determine some variables. So we might look at what could happen, what the options are. what the contingencies are if things don't go well. So you might be talking about possible treatments or possible ways to approach it. The doctor might be talking to the patient about. And then finally, we come out with that final decision, state what we've discovered, and pose the hypothesis or questions. So this is where we get to point. So really, at that point, we're just starting to solve the problem, because now we know what the problem is. But by title, its definition is problem definition process. So finding out what the problem is all about. And as the old adage goes, if you know the problem, then you're halfway to solving it. But many times when we're problem solving, we never actually ascertain what the actual problem is, break out the symptoms from the actual problem and what's going on in the background. And we go back to the old 80-20 rule, in that 20% of the issues solve 80% of the problems. So if we can define exactly what the problems are, we've got a good chance of being effective at solving the problem. So therefore, problem solving techniques we've looked at, there's handouts on those, and there is also links to some of them on a Mind Tools website. And I want you now to watch the video about some problem solving.